Hi, I'm Mallar Ambekar. I want to talk to you about how architecture has helped and is still helping me in working as a designer and a visualizer for films. My background: I'm an architecture graduate from Mumbai and I have been practicing as a designer in the Indian film and entertainment industry. My intriguing explorations and curiosity led to step into the field of set design in order to explore the visual aspects of storytelling while being able to apply the architecture and intellect and have designs a narrative based judgment to them. We shall be talking about the same over here. What In order to begin with conversations like these, let's ask one of the most answered questions and forever discussed topics with regards to the beginning of any such talks. What is architecture? Architecture is commonly defined as a practice of designing and executing building spaces, cities, structures, etc. It is considered to be one of the really old professions known to mankind. As since the very old times, man has been curiously building shelters for himself with the functional and aesthetic appropriations of the designs as well. Will not delve too much into that. Architecture today is a widely practiced profession as well. Well, that too is another topic of discussion. Let's focus on what architecture means with regards to what we shall be talking over here. As the famous architect Norman Foster quotes, architecture is the expression of values, the way we build is a reflection of the way we live. What is the quote penned by Norman Foster as a definition to architecture says over here? The way we build is a reflection of the way we live. It suggests that architecture or spaces are a reflection of what and how we are, the way we live. It defines us. It tells us a story as a viewer, as a subject, and us as being the object as well. A person's space defines the characteristic of the person, and hence we believe that architecture speaks. It tells us a lot more than the fundamental aspects of functions, its services, typology, etc. It goes beyond and reflects us on our own beings. When we think about architecture or a space, we subconsciously start relating to an understanding of its being, and as a result of a story or a reference to attain to a reasoning behind its existence. Architecture as a broader concept does that for us. When we look at examples from the history and periodic times, when we look at a building from the Egyptian times and the Renaissance times, we suggested by an information with regards to why the structures were built, who built them, and how were they built. The distribution of architecture, the distribution of architecture development over the time in three epochs as classical, symbolic, and romantic by the German idealist philosopher George Hegel gives us an understanding about the human progression and the approach towards the imagination of architecture with time and how it has evolved over the centuries and has been influenced and inspired by the art around while representing itself. Humans have throughout been storytellers and receivers of the same as well. The juxtaposition of architecture and demographical advancement in time and space is indicated to a certain sense that architecture is reflective towards our beings and the way we live and what we have been. And hence, periodically, we have arrived at spaces and have defined typologies to these spaces and architectures with regards to its uses. For example, a warehouse, a hospital, an educational institution, a prisons, and so on. Now, if you see these spaces are fundamentally different and exclusive than each other with regard to their functions, yet are defined and addressed by a thought or a narrative. The narratives and imagination of these spaces are different too, but the commonality lies in the purely in the idea of conceiving these spaces and having their functions directed by the narratives of factors such as utility, aesthetics, etc. French architect Quitimer Giconci would put the idea of typology as the word type does not represent so much the idea of something that must be copied or imitated perfectly as the idea of an element that must itself serve as a rule for the model. What does it say? It says that while defining a space or for a particular story or developing a world for a specific narrative, the literal copying or imitation of the already defined spaces may not serve the ideal typological representation of the architecture of the space as the idea or the conceptualization of its rule in terms of its utility. So it's the utility and its effects that would define the typology slightly more than the literal representation and imitation of the space. We'll get a clear idea in order to think on it in a better way when we understand what architecture means for set design and visualization of our films. It is said that humans have always been intrigued and are captured in the world of stories more convincingly in the medium of films. Films are visual depiction of stories. They talk about stories and characters. The world in films are defined by the stories or the characters as well. Films make you delve into the world of an imagination as conceived by its creator. It helps develop a certain perception about the non-existent world. It is also said to take away a person from his own world and existence, though for a brief period of time, into a world that has an emotional comfort and is hypothetical and is imaginative, which we as humans may or may not be part of in our times of existence. History and periodic films, for example, are suggestive and informative for us in terms of the era that they portray, the information of the world that our ancestors perhaps were a part of, and it has only come down to us in the form of stories or visual depictions such as the films. Now, the worlds of films are created by an imagination conceived in order to justify the story and the character's environment and to uplift it so that it is not only an environment or a static backdrop once excluded from these characters, but they themselves have the ability to tell us a story of the world imagined and are suggestive towards its happenings as well. Our subconscious mind hence starts perceiving these worlds and making an understanding for oneself in order to understand the story and get a better judgment of it. A way to understand these worlds is to exclude the characters from the film and observe nothing but the backdrop or the sets that they were a part of. To understand it better, we can look at a few examples I picked. Harry Potter, the fictional fantasy world of Hogwarts in Harry Potter. Grand Hotel, it's a 1932 film, the Art Deco hotel designed by Cedric Gibbons at that time. Barry Lyndon, the world of British society from the 18th century London in one of Stanley Kubrick's masterpieces, which by the way also was created from a reference paintings from the era by Thomas Gaines, painters like Thomas Gainsborough. Living Trilogy, a fine example of a minimalistic yet suggestive world beautifully reflecting on humanscapes in Roy Anderson's trilogy, also places the story and the characters in a certain perspective. Revolutionary Road, the middle class layout of a couple living on Revolutionary Road is informative towards tastes and the way a married couple and the kids lived in and their whole upbringing. The Godfather, the entire trilogy, a beautiful amalgamation of dark mafia world and yet a family world of The Godfather, goes along with the story towards this progression throughout. Schindler's List, a periodic example from the World War II, suggests the living condition of the trapped Jews. It also takes us through various levels of understanding of spaces, showcasing different worlds spanning from the trapped Jews, the Schindler's Company, to Nazi generals and spaces of their inhabitations. 2002 and Interstellar, the world of spaceships and spaces is a different and great examples of architecture that reflects to the positioning of these stories that take you to otherwise non-approachable areas such as these probes, spaces and the planets. Bahubali, the Indian magnanimous of the fictional epic Bahubali, is indicated towards the societal status of the kings and also in a way defines the term and the title Bahubali. Panipat, the world of 18th century India, the then Hindustan, reflects on the architecture and captures it spanning across different timelines, positioning such as the palaces, the tents, different tents with specific utilities throughout the journey, leading to one of the gruesome battles in history. Devdas, the extravagant beautiful palaces of the period from Devdas is suggestive to the richness. Ek Doctor Ki Maut, a scientist's laboratory in his own house sparks a different form in his house. From his house and suggests us the level of dedication the scientist had for his work. Though a part of his house, the laboratory yet is a different world. Dr. Courtney's Ki Amar Kahani, one of V. Shantaram's epic, defines for us the world during the Second World War from the 1940s when a Dr. Courtney was sent to China to provide medical assistance to the troops. The caves, the camps, the army doctors serving the patients beautifully suggests us what it must have been during that time. The Grand Budapest Hotel. The hotel, as filmed by Wes Anderson, goes along with the story and creates an impression for us as to what Anderson wishes to say through the hotel as well. The Sunshine Boys. Once upon a time, a comic star duo are now reduced to living miles away from each other. One of the characters, Willie Clark, who once lived in a suite, now reduced to living in an apartment with innumerable amount of memorabilia around him. Pictures, awards, everything scattered, a couch and a TV that he resides on. is suggestive to what once a star comic, now a grumpy old man, is living and how. Daddy, the world of 1980s Mumbai, India, depicted while showing the story of a gangster turned politician, tells us the story of the era as well. What it meant to have the mills shut down, millions of workers being jobless, and the living conditions of the jobs as well. 1970. One of war epics, as told by Sam Mendes, indicates the world of the battlefield with all its trenches and ditches that inform us while we pass through the film as the journey on the field as to what it means to have a surprise that would literally define your fate. Silence. Martin Scorsese's epic is a good example of confinement and deconfinement and relativity of the Almighty and its existence. Strangers on a Train and Rear Window. Alfred Hitchcock's world, as designed by Ted Howard and Hal Pereira, depicts Hitchcock's intentions and serves as a good definitions to what Hitchcock wants to portray and tell a story with. Now, as an architect, it helps to visualize and imagine these spaces that are directed from a narrative aspect, as well as it helps us to understand the scale and the anthropometry or reflect certain elements in history, etc. That's expected out of it, certainly. A sense of understanding art in terms of scale, color distribution, technical aspects of its execution, aesthetic sensibilities all add up to designing of these worlds and spaces that would justify the characters or push and uplift the story in order to make it more convincing and believable to capture into the minds of the viewer. An idea is conceived by understanding to a certain extent and even relating to the characters to begin with. The characters, their background, their likes and dislikes, their aspirations, their beliefs, their existence define how their spaces and their worlds would be and what their worlds would look like. So much so that regardless of a character's presence in it sometimes, it gives us an understanding of the character and insight into his world, helps us subconsciously imagine the character while viewing the film. These spaces are derived from the narratives, also establish a sense of mood that the story wishes to create in order to portray what it wants to share with us. These worlds hence not only tell us about the character but also gives us an impression of the mood and the ambience it wants us to absorb into, so that we are driven more convincingly and are able to efficiently perceive and understand the story in a much better sense. Architecture helps in looking into these aspects of designs of the film. It helps one, and it certainly has helped me in visualizing a space about a character and the story with regards to its aesthetic aspects as well as the appropriate justification of its necessary senses such as the anthropometry, the history, its relativity to its background, etc. Now, there is a certain practice that I follow in order to develop the ability to imagine a space or a world from the narrative. You may have your own practice that you probably must be doing. Here goes mine. What I do, I pick up a book of a work of fiction, I check if there's a movie made on it, I do not go and watch the movie yet, I finish reading the book and then go and watch the movie. This helps me visualizing the films for my own self on my own terms. When I read, because what happens is when I read it without being told or imagine because of an impression it would essentially create the moment I watch the film made on it. It helps me imagine and develop the world and the story on my own abilities and thought processes. Now, when I go and watch the film, it helps as a cross check, as a learning as to how someone else has visualized it, what justifications are there by the performance in it, how differently the same story has been told. Yeah, and this exercise helps me reflect on my own understandings and the very notions of visualizations and designs. It helps unlearn and learn new things. It feels like reading. It feels like a written poem. A book feels like a written poem, for example, because there are layers and factors of music and instruments and the tonality which uplifts and justifies the written song. Similarly, when it's conceived, it's made into with these layers and factors of different collaborative minds coming together, making the film of the written book. The initial reading helps you cultivate the ability to imagine. The cross-checking it with its film helps us in understanding how these layers and factors have performed in order to tell the same story. I probably will repeat that. The initial reading helps you cultivate the ability to imagine the cross-taking of it with its film helps in understanding how these layers and factors have performed in order to tell the same story. My examples include George Orwell's book 1984, which was made by the same name, 1984, one of Bengal's and India's most celebrated literature works, Pathar Panchali, which was made into a film by the great Satyajit Ray, a book by Paula Hawkins, A Girl on the Train, which was made by the same name as well, amongst the very first, back in 2005-6, probably a Chetan book, Three Mistakes of My Life, that got made into Kai Po Che. There are various examples like these. Now, this is how I practice. You may have your different approach towards developing yourself as a designer and a visualizer. Make sure you adhere to that and keep growing. Keep reading, keep watching films. Do let me know what your thoughts are on the stuff that you just watched on my video, and if you yourself have your techniques, methods and examples of great set design, great production design or even great films, be sure to let me know. I would be more than happy to watch them and discuss as well. Stay in touch. Bye bye.